is 6:30 in the morning almost. I am still at the cabin, as you may have seen at the end of the last video in this series where I had read Stephen King's The Dead Zone. I'm up north in the UP for today and tomorrow, basically doing like a little bit of a mini vacation while I still technically work with Robert's family. His parents and his grandparents are both up here with us, and we will be here until Wednesday, very early Wednesday morning. We will be heading back. But it also has snowed up here, so I don't quite know what all is expected, just because we also know that the entire state at this point on November 16th has gone back into pretty much not full lockdown, but a lot of like the bars and restaurants, dine-in wise, are no longer going to be able to be open. They're still available for like takeout and stuff, but they're not having dine-in services anymore. There's still quite a bit of things that are currently open, like I know like gyms and salons are open still. A lot of stores are still open, things of that nature. Like it's not back to immediate lockdown like we were back in March, but we have taken a bit of a step back because the state has been pretty awful. But anyway, aside from that, today I'm going to be getting started with Stephen King's next read, which is Firestarter. So this book was published in 1980 at first, and is apparently it's dedicated to Shirley Jackson, who, if you guys don't know, is the author of The Haunting of Hill House that was created into a TV show, and the newest season, The Haunting of Bly Manor, just came out not too long ago. So I don't know really anything about Firestarter. I've never heard of this one, but this is the synopsis that is on the back of it. It says, Andy McGee and Vicki Tomlinson were once college students looking to make some extra cash, volunteering as test subjects for an experiment orchestrated by the clandestine government organization known as The Shop. But the outcome unlocked exceptional latent psychic talents for the two of them, manifesting in even more terrifying ways than when they fell in love and had a child. Their daughter Charlie has been gifted with the most extraordinary and uncontrollable power ever seen, pyrokinesis, the ability to create fire with her mind. Now the merciless agents of the Shop are in hot pursuit to apprehend this unexpected genetic anomaly for their own diabolical ends by any means necessary, including violent actions that may well ignite the entire world around them as Charlie retaliates with a fury of her own. Yeah. So this is another kind of science fiction based story, I believe, based on that synopsis. We first saw Stephen King's real dive into a little bit of science fiction in The Dead Zone. It wasn't really anything much. It was more of like you were based in this 1970s, more contemporary setting at the time that the book was published. And it incorporated this small element of science fiction where the main character, after having been in a car accident and in a coma for 4.5 years, wakes up and develops the ability to read and understand people's small glimpses of their future, sometimes immediate, sometimes years ahead, depending on the person, by either touching them or by touching an object of theirs that like is near. So that kind of leads me to believe that this is kind of going to be an era where maybe Stephen King starts going into a little bit of more science fiction heavy things. This seems like it might be much more heavy on the science fiction because we not only have two characters who have psychic talents, which we're not sure what they are as of yet, but we also have a main character who is their daughter that has pyrokinesis, which is the first time we've seen that. We did see telekinesis, the ability to just move objects in general with the mind. That was in Carrie. That was King's first published work. In Carrie, the main character, this 17-year-old girl, has had this ability since she was pretty much a child, to be able to move things, and nobody knew about it until when she basically like had this big meltdown at the very end of the book. And so my thought is that Charlie's going to be like Carrie times 10, and especially because she's being hunted down by these government agents, like this is going to intensify a lot of stuff, which means that there's probably going to be a lot of very intense scenes with Charlie like pretty much trying to protect herself in a lot of ways. This book is not including the afterword 562 pages. So this is much longer than The Dead Zone was, which was about 426. So this is this is like 140 pages more than that. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is going to be kind of getting back to where several of King's books are going to start getting longer again, because with The Long Walk, that book was less than 400 pages, and then The Dead Zone was still only about 426 pages, like I said, which was kind of on the smaller end of what King has done in the past, because many of his books leading up to this point, with the exception of Carrie, were upwards of 500, 600 pages sometimes. And then The Stand, the extended edition, was 1,152 pages. So it's going to be interesting getting back into a longer piece like this. But I hope that this is going to have the same feel that it did with The Dead Zone, where because the story is more, hopefully that the story will be more grounded in reality, that will make it a lot easier to feel like you're flying through it, and then to like, it makes it just a lot easier to understand the story, because that's what I really liked about The Dead Zone, was like it was so rooted in reality and so rooted in a contemporary setting. Even though it was in the 1970s, it was grounded so much in that setting that it helped it seem more like a real story, as opposed to like relying so much on the supernatural elements that made the story seem very otherworldly. It was very refreshing to see that with The Dead Zone, so maybe this will do the same. I'm not sure. I haven't started it yet. I, though, have to start work. I had to start work at about 6 a.m. this morning because I wanted to be able to get done a little earlier today so that I could spend some time with Robert's family and check out stuff in the UP and everything, like in like the later part of the afternoon, and just be able to spend time with them. So today and tomorrow I'll be doing that. Wednesday morning, though, I'm not sure what exactly is going to happen, because we're leaving early Wednesday morning. Like, we'll probably be leaving around like 6, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, and it's about a 5-hour drive back home. So I don't know when I'm going to be able to start work on Wednesday, if at all, and I'm going to have to like arrange that with the rest of my schedule for the week, because I have to have 40 hours at the end of the week. I may say good morning. It is about 5 to 8 in the morning. This is the last full day we are having up north, and we're coming back tomorrow morning home. And I just wanted to give a quick update with Firestarter, because I am now on page 114, and basically all that I can say about it is I love the premise of this. If you are in any way a fan of like X-Men or anything to do with like people with superpowers in any way, this is definitely something that you would like. Right now, the very beginning of the story, we've only really learned that there is this man named Andy. He has a daughter named Charlene they had with this woman named Vicky, and we learn kind of how exactly they got their superpowers, and then kind of therefore how Charlene got hers. She goes by Charlie, and she's about 7 years old at the beginning of the book. But we learn very quickly that Andy and Charlie are basically on the run. Vicky had died in some kind of freak accident that I think Charlie was a part of. I don't know necessarily. That hasn't been fully explained, but we know that Vicky basically is dead, and Andy is having to take care of Charlie all on his own, and they're on the run because basically they go into like the background of how Andy and Vicky met, which was in college. They did this psychological experiment at college. Like, a lot of times the psychology department will have students do these experiments, or even sometimes the professors and the doctors there will do experiments in order to test different things and different theories and all of that they're still kind of expanding on because it's an academic field. This is basically kind of the time where like a lot of things post-Vietnam at least were happening, where like there was a lot of testing on LSD and other hallucinogenic drugs, and Andy and Vicky, in the very beginning of the book, they find out that these drugs basically have caused these latent psychological powers or psychic powers to develop. Andy is able to essentially influence people with his mind. He's able to kind of give them what he calls a little push to do what he wants. Vicky is more of a telekinetic person. She's able to move things with her mind, kind of like how Carrie is in the book Carrie. They basically realize, though, that what they had gone through was like a government experiment, and they kind of get trapped within the government in this place called the Shop, which is, I think, in Virginia. And it's basically a government organization that is looking to test on people with psychic abilities, and unfortunately for a lot of them, a lot of people die. it is found out that many of the people that did the college psychological experiment did end up dying in some very freak accidents. Either they basically went insane, or their bodies physically gave up on them, and or they just suffered very violent deaths in a lot of ways. So the whole thing is that with Andy, he is trying to raise Charlie on his own because, like I said, Vicky has died recently, and the people that run the shop are basically after them because now that they have Charlie also then has some latent powers. Well, not latent, she's actually able to start fires. She's what they call a pyrokinetic. She's able to create fire with her mind and use it. And unfortunately, she's still very young, so a lot of the power she has is not really well developed. She doesn't know how to use it. She doesn't know how to stop it from happening, even though she tries very, very hard to limit her ability to use her power, but she's still very young. But because of the fact that Charlie is the product of two people who went through this psychological experiment that brought up these psychic powers, and the child then also has this kind of psychic ability of a sense. I don't know if that's necessarily the right term though. So because she has that ability, though, the shop wants to get a hold of Charlie, whether that means to experiment on her more or, possibly kill her. It's not clear as to what their end game is with all of it. But what we do know is that the shop is basically looking to get these two and kind of quarantine them away from the rest of the world because they could possibly do some major damage. Andy is also having a hard time because his use of his ability does end up physically deteriorate him. He has major headaches whenever he uses his powers, and if he uses them too often in too short of an amount of time, he gets very, very run down. He can't really move very much, and he has to have a longer rest period, basically. So he can only use his ability sparingly. But unfortunately, in this scenario, he can't do that. He has to find a way to protect his daughter by any means necessary, even if it means his own detriment. And Charlie, even though she's very young, understands that there's something not right going on, that she knows her dad is trying to figure out how to protect the both of them. She knows that there's a lot of danger that surrounds her, and unfortunately for her, a lot of that anxiety that she has does manifest with her powers surfacing and causing some slight damage here and there. Nothing major, but enough to where it could warrant attention and get them in a lot of trouble. So that's basically all we know so far with Firestarter. I really like this a lot. I think that it reminds me a lot of The Dead Zone in the sense that it feels very grounded in reality. It's just kind of like this happenstance thing where somebody develops an ability and it kind of just changes their whole life and they have to learn to live with it. That's very similar to how The Dead Zone felt. But I basically have got to a point where we're focusing more on the shop and the characters that are involved in the shop. The first major part of the story dealt with Andy and Charlie and seeing a lot of Andy's past through flashbacks and understanding how exactly he and Vicky met, and then how they got married and had Charlie, and some slight instances of when Charlie was growing up, like when she was a baby, when she was a toddler, and how they noticed very early on her abilities, and they had to find a way to cope with them and then also keep themselves away from the shop because they knew that if they showcase these abilities, they get thrown right back into the shop and it would be disastrous. But we're looking into the shop right now, and there's a character who basically was like the ringleader of this entire experiment called Wanless, a very older gentleman. He is someone who a lot of people at this point in time, they think that he's going crazy. They think he is off his rocker, basically. He basically explains to one of the other characters that runs the shop that, it's important that they catch Charlie and Andy, and they may have to kill the both of them in order to protect the rest of the world. And it's kind of this really moral dilemma in the sense that these are still human beings, but with their abilities they could cause some real damage, and not everybody in the world at this point in time understands what it is to have these psychic abilities and the cost of having them, basically. So Wanless is kind of one of those characters, I think, where he's evil to his core, but I think that he got in over his head in terms of what he was expecting when he first did these experiments with the hallucinogenic drugs, when he was testing them on these people in college. And there's essentially this whole group of people that Vicky and Andy were a part of that they call Lot 6, which was like the group of people that were in a prison camp after going through the LSD experiment, that were put away because they all showed some kind of psychic ability, or they were basically being tested on and checked on after the experiment so that they could like monitor their abilities. Some of them didn't show anything, some of them did, and then later on when they were released, they had issues, like I said, like they either killed themselves or they were in violent accidents or something like that. Mostly they had a deteriorated mental health issue because they kept hearing things, they kept basically seeing things, and they kept, having these really awful visions of things that happen, and then a lot of times too, like their powers would manifest and it would scare them, so a lot of them would go through these really awful mental health episodes that would then lead to their deaths. And that's kind of how most of Lot 6 has been, with the exception of this man named James Richardson, who didn't show anything. He didn't show any psychic ability whatsoever. And then also the exception being Andy and Vicky, because those two didn't talk about, I don't believe, their abilities, but it was found out that they did have them, especially after they had Charlie. So that's why they were all on the run. And then again, something happened to Vicky. We don't know. I think we're going to learn more about that as the story goes on, and what exactly Charlie did, if she had anything to do with Vicky's death, if it was accidental, or if something just kind of happened and Charlie couldn't stop it or something like that. So I think that this is going to be an interesting story. I would like to see if this basically is a story where we follow Charlie as she grows up, or if this is going to be something that all happens like while she's about 7 years old, because I think either way the story would be really interesting to see it from like this child's perspective. But then also, if she gets older, does she end up developing her power? Does she end up actually learning to control it? And if so, how does she do it? And then does she ultimately still continue to lose control in times of, anxiousness or times of high stress kind of thing? So I think this is going to be a really fun one to read. Personally, I think I'm going to like this a lot more. This is definitely more along the lines of the science fiction realm than the Dead Zone was. This is much more heavy on the science fiction based idea. I think that this is going to be a really good jumping off point to seeing what Stephen King can do with science fiction in terms of playing with supernatural powers kind of thing, like he did with Carrie and he did with the Dead Zone. Okay, so I have a small correction to make about this. Lot 6 is not the name of the group of people that were tested on. It is actually the name of the drug that they were essentially injected with. There is a part in this that Andy uses to further explain kind of what exactly happened, because I think that I may have gotten some stuff confused. So he basically lays it all out, not info dumpy wise, but he does tell somebody about what exactly happened. And he basically describes Lot 6 as this drug that altered the chromosomes of the individuals that it was used on, which included himself and Vicky. And because their chromosomes were altered, it then created this kind of mutated gene of sorts that then was passed down to Charlie, which is why Charlie is kind of more of the mutant, and also explains how she has not only pyrokinesis, but even has some of the abilities of her mother with telekinesis to a smaller extent. And she also does have her father's ability of being able to like influence or push certain individuals or objects to bend to her will in a sense. But those are on a much smaller scale. Her main power though is the pyrokinesis. I think they also do call that group the Lot 6 group because that was the drug that was used specifically on them. But Lot 6 is actually more in reference to the drug itself as opposed to the group. So on page 154 of this, Andy goes into exactly like who is chasing him to this character he meets, and there is some information about exactly what the shop is. And so he says, the shop is really the DSI, Department of Scientific Intelligence. I read in an article about 3 years ago that some wiseacre nicknamed it the shop in the early 60s after a science fiction story called The Weapons Shop of Ishtar by a guy named Van Vogt, I think, but that doesn't matter. What they're supposed to be involved in are domestic scientific projects which may have present or future application to matters bearing on national security. The definition is from their charter, and the thing they're most associated with in the public mind is the energy research they're funding and supervising, electromagnetic stuff and fusion power. They're actually involved in a lot more. Charlie and I are part of an experiment that happened a long time ago. It happened before Charlie was even born. Her mother was also involved. She was murdered. The shop was responsible. So we also then learn, not just through Andy, but earlier in the book, we do learn through Charlie that the mother figure, Vicky, was in fact murdered in some capacity by the shop, whether it was they shot and killed her or they took her away and killed her there. But it basically, they are the ones to blame for Vicky's death. Then Andy basically from there goes into the idea of like what exactly Charlie is and how she was created and why she's kind of this mutant in a sense. He says they want to study her, see if they can figure out what makes her able to do what she can do, and even more, I think they want her as an exhibit. They want to use her to reactivate the Lot 6 program, which the Lot 6 program is the name of the program because that was the drug that they called. He describes it as kind of what he thinks to be a possible synthetic glandular secretion, but he's not even 100% certain. That's just his best guess based on what exactly happened to him and Vicky. And so there's a little bit more information about that does get kind of brought in, and actually the way that I think that they express it is really well done because it's not like an info dump, but it does come up kind of conveniently because there is this character that Andy and Charlie meet that, you know, wants to know what exactly is happening. And so he's like the first person that Andy, you know, actually tells anything about what's really going on. And, you know, they do end up helping Andy and Charlie. So very, very interesting way to bring up the actual, like, what the kind of crash course of what exactly happened, because I feel like with a lot of the beginning parts of Andy's story of like learning about what happened to him and Vicky, it wasn't really 100% clear, which I think is kind of the point. You're not supposed to really know exactly what happened in its entirety, but then this point in the story, you do learn exactly what he believes is like happening and what exactly happened to get him and Charlie where he is now. And, you know, we learn more about what exactly the shop is that he has learned about. Because even in the chapters that, you know, go into people from the shop that, you know, work with them and, you know, you don't get a lot of information as to what they are. You just do know that there is at least one character who does not necessarily believe that what the shop is doing is exactly right. And there is kind of this mad scientist kind of character that's involved in it. So I don't know, I just feel like it's very interesting to see kind of how that is. And I just wanted to update what exactly Lot 6 was because I felt like I was a little bit confused by it earlier and I wanted to clear that up. Hello everybody, it's been a couple days. I'm not quite to the 300 page mark yet in Firestarter, but I did want to talk a little bit about something that I think has just really come up that I don't think I've talked about before, and I would like to get some kind of like insight into it, but there's a couple things I want to talk about first. So first things first, I do like the book. I think I'm almost, if not already, halfway through it. I look like I'm getting fairly close to that point. So far it's fine. The book is, you know, really good. I like what it's going for it, but it's not blowing me away by any means. It's not like the greatest thing on the face of the earth. It is very fun to read. I am enjoying it. I am feeling very many things for Charlene and Andy. I feel like, you know, they're definitely characters I can, you know, feel for and sympathize with because they're on the run. They're being persecuted because of the fact that they both have abilities and that they're, you know, being targets because they're going to be tested on and all these things. So I like that aspect. I feel like I do have a connection to them because of that. Also, Andy has been going through a hell of a lot with the fact that he's trying to protect his daughter. He lost his wife who he really cared about and he's very scared. And so I feel like that the emotional connection I have to him and to Charlene is very prevalent in the story, so I do really appreciate that. I do also still really enjoy the writing style. I think that the simplistic nature and the more grounded nature of the story makes it something that's a little bit more timeless and makes it very easy to understand this world, kind of like in the Dead Zone, where I felt that the writing style really helped with understanding the story and also really helped with making better connections in the story than it would if I was reading something much earlier from King's work, like Salem's Lot or The Long Walk or something like that. One thing I want to bring up though is this character Rainbird. Rainbird is a basically Native American man. I guess he's like a mercenary because he does go off and kill somebody that is involved in the shop that we know about. And, you know, he does it because he's been hired to do so through somebody else in the shop. The thing with Rainbird, though, is that he has this weird fascination with Charlene, and I don't think it's a sexual thing, because he even says, I just read a chapter where he was talking to somebody in the shop about it in order to understand, like, because he will only go after Charlene and do these things for the shop if he gets to be her friend, and he wants to know her very intimately, but not in a sexual intimacy kind of way. The way that he describes it is, he says, but I'll know her. She and I are going to be friends. If she is as powerful as all things indicate, she and I are going to be great friends. So I don't think it's supposed to be in a sexual nature, but the thing is it makes me still very uncomfortable, which I guess is the point of it, because Rainbird is a man where he kind of has this thing about death. Like, he's basically, he calls it, he's hunting for his own death. And in an earlier chapter, I think it's even mentioned what exactly is going on. About 100 pages beforehand, we first see John Rainbird, who is the character. He's the mercenary. And in the chapter, the very beginning of it, it talks about how he has this thing about death where he's been preparing for this inevitability for 20 years or more. Dealing death had always been his business and was the only trade he ever excelled at, because, like I said, he's like a mercenary or a kill for hire kind of thing. And he became more and more interested in it as he grew older. As an artist, will become more interested in the qualities and levels of light, as writers will feel for character and nuance, like blind men reading Braille. What interested him most was the actual leaving, the actual exaltation of the soul, the exit from the body, and what human beings knew as life, and the passing into something else. What must it be like to feel yourself slipping away? Did you think it was a dream from which you would awake? Was the Christian devil there with his fork, ready to jam it through your shrieking soul and carry it down to hell like a piece of meat on a shish kebab? Was there joy? Did you know you were going? What is it that the eyes of the dying see? So he kind of is like fascinated with this idea of death and what kind of comes with it, but he's not really clear on what exactly he's interested in about her. Rainbird does make me very uncomfortable in the sense that, like, you know, he says it's not a sexual thing about why he wants to be involved with her, but it's very clear there's some kind of strange, possibly nefarious angle about it, and it's very, very creepy. I don't know how to handle it, but one thing I will say is that I do want to know more about Rainbird. I want to know more about how exactly he got to where he is. I don't think the word psychopath or sociopath really is appropriate for this character, but there's something very different about him that I want to know more about. Like, I feel like there's not very many chapters so far, at the very least, that we see with Rainbird to where I feel like we get this idea about who he is. So I guess in this chapter he does talk about the fact that he wants to see what it's like to kill a child. It's a little disturbing, because I wonder if sociopath would maybe be the right word, because he doesn't seem to have any real, like, regard for human life. He doesn't really seem to have any care about the fact that he goes and he kills these people. I mean, because he does it for a living, and he also has, like I just said, he has this thing about where he wants to see how it would be to kill a child as opposed to killing a full-grown adult that, like, he normally does. But I don't know how that's fascinating for him. Like, I wonder if it has something to do with, like, the innocence of a child or whatever, and if that is something about why he wants to kill her. Like, I'm fascinated and terrified by John Rainbird, and I would like to know more about why he is how he is. I hope that in the rest of this book we get to see more of that, because there's so many things about him that I want to know, and that I feel like would help explain why he wants to, you know, become friends with Charlene and then ultimately possibly kill her. And I wonder too if, like, he reaches a point where, like, maybe that turns around or something. I would have high hopes for it. He also mentions that like he knows so much about what the shop is doing and it's wrong and it is in a lot of ways illegal, and so he's like, if you don't let me do these things, I will basically out you guys to the higher powers and you will get shut down, you will probably be jailed and all these things. And so like he has his own angle for it, but we're not clear as to why exactly he really wants to get that close to Charlene and what exactly his end game is, if it's just actually killing her or if there's something a little bit more nefarious to it or whatever. Interesting so far. I feel like that Rainbird is definitely one of the most interesting characters of them all, but like I said, I do feel very much for Charlene and Andy. I feel like my emotional connection to them is solid, but in terms of the overall story, I'm not blown away. It's not like top tier, but it's not necessarily bad. It is something that is compelling and I am moving through it. Okay, it is Sunday. I'm still not quite 400 pages into the book, but I'm on page 360. I have about 200 pages left, and I truthfully today, it's Sunday, so I have like the whole day to do anything really I want. I was gonna do a lot of journaling stuff today, but truthfully, I'm in the mood to just read this all day and try to finish it. So it's currently just after 11 o'clock in the morning. I don't really have anything that is like absolutely major I need to do. Everything that I could do is like chore-based stuff or like just basically getting stuff arranged for like, I don't even know, stuff that I could do over the course of this week. So basically, I'm just gonna sit here and I think read this entire thing because it's gonna be a lazy Sunday. I've been working on this for almost a week now and I kind of want to just finish it, and I'm actually still really interested in it. There's like this whole thing with Rainbird though that I'm kind of worried about because, you know, he like I said before, he's kind of like this really psychotic individual and he's got this weird fascination for Charlene that I don't really understand as of yet, but I think that with him starting to gain her trust now, I'm going to start understanding why he wants to do this and what exactly it is about her that is so fascinating, because she's like an 8-year-old kid and this grown man, this like 40-some-year-old man is like has a real disgusting kind of shining to her, and I don't know how I feel about it, but I also don't know what the intent is behind it. I don't think it's sexual, but I think that there's some kind of like something that doesn't sit right that I want to read more about to understand. Okay, it's done. I just finished Firestarter. I read like the last about less than 30 pages of it today because I had almost got to the point where I could have finished it last night, but by the time I did, I was very tired, so I just decided to stave it off until today. I am gonna give this, I don't know, like there's nothing inherently wrong with it, I guess, other than the fact that I still don't feel like by the end of it I understand John Rainbird very much. So I guess I'll give it like a 4 out of 5 stars because it's really freaking good and it's a really interesting kind of science fiction mutant based story. The writing is very easy to run through. I will say it's a little slow for most of the book because it's not really a jam-packed action-filled story. It's got action-like scenes in different parts of it, but it's very slow. It's very methodical in kind of the way that it's written, where a lot of the story is based in Charlene trying to save herself and her father, and Andy is doing the same thing, kind of thing for the both of them. So it's very methodical in the sense that like the story takes its time in trying to, you know, have them figure out what to do, and the end of it's actually very, you know, it is sad in some ways, but the ending is actually kind of satisfactory in terms of what exactly happens to Charlene and Andy in a lot of ways. I think that it works the best for this kind of story, and I'm actually really surprised with how much I like it because I feel like, you know, there's nothing inherently wrong, like I said. I just feel like that my main issue is that we don't ever really find out why John Rainbird is the way he is. We just know he's kind of this psychotic individual who becomes obsessed with Charlene. He's hell-bent on wanting to kill her, but there's not really a reason as to why, other than maybe the fact he's chasing his own death, that kind of thing. So I don't quite know. Like, his characters are very much enigmatic to me, and maybe that's the point, and I just can't accept that because I feel like I just want to know more about him. I really love the relationship between Andy and Charlene. It's very clear. It's a genuine relationship. Like, they adore each other. Andy adores his daughter more than anything, is willing to do anything he can to try to protect her, but he also has his own flaws and his own faults and his own demons that he does have to deal with, especially when he is, you know, kidnapped by the shop and is having to go through with their testing and all these things. You see him basically regressing as an individual because he is trapped. He doesn't know what he's going to do, if he's going to be able to escape, and he doesn't know what's happening to his daughter, who he cares about more than anything. And the love that Charlie has for her father is reciprocated so much. She loves her father so much because, you know, he took care of her. He, you know, helped her with understanding her power, all these things. So the relationship there is something I feel like I really resonated with. I really felt like I connected to the characters because of that. And you know, it made it so that I hated everybody that had to do with the shop, which I think was the intent, because these poor people are just trying to live their lives with what they know and how they can, you know, live it, and they're being hunted because they're considered monsters for having these abilities. Charlene more so than anything, and she's just a little girl. She's 7 years old when the story starts off, and she goes through 2 years essentially worth of pain and torment and running and all these things, and she doesn't get to have a normal childhood. And she wouldn't have necessarily the most normal childhood because of her powers, but she should have had a better chance in a normal childhood, and she didn't get that, and it's frustrating for me just because she's so young. But she grows up very, very quickly in this book, and it's almost disheartening because of the fact, you know, that she's having to be on the run and understand that, you know, people are after her because they consider her dangerous. So I really like this a lot. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5 stars. I don't believe that at the beginning of this video I was able to go into a little bit of background about this book, so I'm going to do that real quick just to kind of see, you know, what the reception of it was, how it was marketed, all these things. Okay, so according to Wikipedia, the book is a science fiction horror thriller novel published in September of 1980. I would not consider it horror or thriller. I would just say it's more on the science fiction side, but I kind of would say it's almost in the same vein as how The Dead Zone was, where like it's more of a contemporary based story with a character who just happens to have some kind of ability that makes it kind of not necessarily rooted in full-on reality, so it's kind of that same vein. I wouldn't consider it a horror thriller though, because it's not very terrifying. It's not as action-packed, like I said, like a thriller normally would be. Originally though, in July and August, there were 2 excerpts from the novel that were published in Omni, which is a science and science fiction magazine published in the US and the UK. It was nominated as Best Novel for the British Fantasy Award, the Locust Pole Award, and the Balrog Award, and in 1984 it was adapted into a film, which I've heard a lot of people say was really good. Now, it was, like I said, adapted into a film made by the same name in 1984, directed by Mark L. Lester, and it starred Drew Barrymore as Charlie, which doesn't surprise me because in the 80s she was still a young child, and she was like a huge actress. She was a huge child star because of like E.T. and all these things. And I actually really like the idea of Drew Barrymore as a kid being Charlie, because that makes a lot of sense. She's got the kind of vibe that, like the aesthetic I would see of Charlie, with the blonde hair and the kind of like pert little button lips almost. Like, I can see it. And then we have David Keith as Andy, who David Keith is known as like, he's known in a lot of movies as being like in the military. Like, you see him in a lot of military based movies. So and then you have George C. Scott as Rainbird, who I do not know him. It also starred Heather Locklear as Vicky, who is Charlie's mother, which I also think that works very well, considering that Heather Locklear also is a blonde. And then we have Martin Sheen as Cap, who is a character that basically is the one that's like the head of the shop at this point, which again, Martin Sheen as kind of a bad guy does work very well for me. I like that idea. There was a TV movie sequel called Firestarter Rekindled that was made in 2002 and starred Marguerite Moreau as a grown-up Charlie and Malcolm McDowell as Rainbird, which I don't know if I like that so much because of what happens to Rainbird in this book. In Saturday Night Live, on an episode that aired in 2007, Drew Barrymore reprised her role as Charlie, now an adult and married, in a fake commercial for Firestarter brand smoked sausages. In April 2017, Jason Blum and Akiva Goldsman announced that they were going to remake Firestarter for Universal, and Blumhouse with Goldsman co-writing with Scott Teems. Then in June 2018, Variety reported that Fatih Akin, I do not know how to pronounce that name, I apologize, he was announced to direct the remake, and then in December 2019, Collider reported that Keith Thomas will direct it. So they haven't really actually made it. They've gone through a lot of changes with directors and I guess writers and stuff like that. So as of now, there's nothing else that has been released about it, but as of 2019, they were still talking about the fact that they were going to remake it, but I guess it must have changed hands in terms of vision and all that stuff. So it doesn't really go into anything about the reception or anything of the book, as far as like whether it was, a success or whatever. I think overall, this is actually not necessarily one of my favorites, but it's definitely like one of like, it's obviously, like I said, in the 4-star range. So it's a very good book. I would highly recommend it. Another standalone, I think that would be really good for a lot of people that are looking to go into Stephen King's more science fiction realm. Again, like The Dead Zone, it's not necessarily something that is super, super science fiction-y. It's more of a contemporary story that adds a science fiction element. Very fun to read, very slow at times, but it's one of those books where, like, because it's so rooted in contemporary nature, that it does have those slow moments because you're trying to find out what's going to happen, all these things. But as a standalone, a great start. It gives you a taste of what King is able to do without going so overboard that you're, disgusted by any of the scenes because they're graphic, or doesn't, get super complicated to where someone who is getting introduced to King for the first time wouldn't be able to follow what's happening, nor would they feel like everything was kind of confusing in terms of like what the whole setting is and how the characters work and everything about it. So definitely would recommend as another really great standalone to start off with. So yeah, let me know what you guys thought of Firestarter. If you have read it, down in the comments below. What were your thoughts on it? Did you feel like it was a thrilling adventure? I didn't think it was necessarily a thriller, but I could see why some people would think that with some of the action scenes that are involved in it. Let me know also what you felt about John Rainbird, whether or not you understand him better than I do, because I feel like I don't know who he is at all. I don't feel like I understand anything about what his whole point was with you know, being so fascinated with Charlie. Thank you all so much for joining me in this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you're not already and you'd like to be, hit the button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys.